Christian Eriksen is one of the greatest Danish footballers to ever grace the game. Coming to his prime and leading the nation into Euro 2020 should have been a great stage in his career, but what happened to Eriksen shook the whole world. Today we're going to look at how Eriksen was on the brink of death, how he was brought back to life, and how he got himself back into the Premier League. So let's dive into it. What on earth happened to Christian Eriksen? The moment that shook the Euros. Denmark were playing their opening game of Euro 2020 to a packed stadium against Finland. It was 0-0 coming up to half-time, and a game that wasn't going down as decidedly unmemorable, as the Danes' chief playmaker Eriksen was doing his best to conduct the orchestra. Nothing suggested what would happen at 42 minutes. Denmark were about to take a throw-in, and Eriksen was waiting to receive the ball. Suddenly, Eriksen collapsed near the touchline. He had no one near him, and it was immediately obvious something was horribly wrong. Eriksen's teammate Simon Kjær leapt to immediate and essential action. He knew something was up right away and ensured Eriksen's airways weren't blocked whilst performing CPR. Kjær was acting on instinct and, fortunately for Eriksen, had some prior knowledge of performing CPR and was close to him. As this happened, the game was temporarily suspended as the crowd watched on grimly. Eriksen wasn't moving and he wasn't responding. The physios and team doctor were on quickly to back up Kjær, and not long after the paramedics came in to take over. It's a critical time in getting the heart restarted and ensuring too long doesn't pass without oxygen to the brain. The paramedics used a defibrillator on Eriksen to try and kickstart his heart again. Eriksen was unresponsive for 5 minutes. As Eriksen later put it himself, he was dead for 5 minutes. People were fearing the worst. He was brought around, thankfully, and was awake en route to the hospital. During the ambulance ride there, Eriksen was naturally struck by what had happened. He was terrified. He told his wife he'd never be able to play football again. He was fortunate though. The actions of Kjær, the team doctors and physios, as well as the medical staff, saved Eriksen's life in a horrific situation in front of a packed crowd. Their actions were recognised by UEFA, who awarded them all the President's Award. Eriksen was in recovery the following day, and though he felt rough, quickly gave fans an update on social media, posting from his hospital bed. The football world and the wider world were all willing Eriksen to survive relatively unscathed, and thankfully he did. But almost no one could have envisioned Eriksen playing again. Just how did this miracle happen? Recovery and resurrection. The heart is a complicated organ. You can be as fit as a fiddle, but as we've seen with several sports stars, sometimes the worst can happen. Eriksen was pretty lucky in the end, but going forward something needed to be done to minimise the chances of him collapsing again. The one advantage of it being in a stadium full of people and full of medics was the instant attention he received. This helped him avoid brain damage and, even worse, death. Eriksen was implanted with a cardioverter defibrillator. It required an operation which can have complications, but thankfully for Eriksen it was a complete success. So what does the implantable device do? It's not unlike a pacemaker, helping to regulate and control the heart rate. If there's a sudden cardiac arrest, the small device can restart the heart. Eriksen is the first top-flight player to have such a device. Experts insist it is durable enough to cope with the intensity of elite-level professional football. Eriksen was back in the game. Brentford comeback. Understandably, many clubs were wary of taking the chance on Eriksen. He was not permitted to play in Serie A because of the device too. His time at Inter was over. Eriksen was only 29. He'd made an astonishing and quick recovery, but did clubs believe it was too quick? This was less than a year after the horrifying collapse against Finland. Under normal circumstances, the likelihood of Brentford being able to sign a player of Eriksen's age and standing would be, well, almost zero. They were willing to take the gamble though, offering him a short-term contract from January until the end of the season. Eriksen had some work to do. His fitness was in question due to a lack of intense training and game time. He couldn't just leap straight into a side. In Eriksen's career, he'd been largely utilised as a number 10, given freedom to roam. He'd start centrally or play as a narrow wideman, drifting infield. He was always moving, covering a lot of ground. Would he have to change his style? A month after arriving at Brentford, Eriksen made his debut against Newcastle, coming on as a substitute. It seemed as if he was being employed as a deep-lying playmaker. Was it a safety-first approach by Thomas Frank? Eriksen had legs around him and lots of willing runners. As Eriksen continued to appear for Brentford during his 11 appearances, he became an instant cult figure with Bees fans. He's a touch of class, a Rolls-Royce player the likes of which they've not seen. Their season had been going through a rough patch around January, looking like they might get sucked into a relegation battle, but Eriksen's presence saw them have a turnaround in form. He provided vision and an exceptional range of passing, becoming almost like the Brentford Pirlo, only exemplified by his superb set pieces. It was the heartwarming story of the year, seeing Eriksen play again and show his class, while perhaps sensibly adapting to a more disciplined role that wouldn't push his running quite so much. A particularly memorable moment came against Norwich. Brandon Williams was challenged from behind and turned to react angrily whilst on the floor. When he saw it was Eriksen, he grabbed him for a hug instead. Eriksen then made an emotional return to international football in March 2022 as well. Understandably, his reception, his first appearance since collapsing, was sensational, a beautiful moment in football. Eriksen ended his time at Brentford as a short-lived but hugely popular club hero. Bees fans hoped he'd stay on, and he was offered a new deal. He scored a goal and registered 4 assists, but his key passes and involvement in everything great the Bees were doing was clear to see. Eriksen wasn't just back on the pitch, he was back playing brilliantly. Sadly for Brentford, Eriksen took another offer. Back on the big stage. It's often been said that United have made strange signings under the Glazers. Their overriding plan is always brought into question. Eriksen came as a 30-year-old who a year prior was close to death. Fans' reaction was mixed. He'd only played 11 games for Brentford. He hadn't had to endure a full pre-season or the rigours of a long Premier League season. He also had the benefit of a club with lower expectations. United is a different kettle of fish. He came with a big reputation, but a worry that his best days were behind him, and United had gone this route too often. Erik ten Hag came from the Dutch league and knows the kind of technical players that flourish in the league. It was where Eriksen learned his trade. Ten Hag also had Casemiro coming to the club, the kind of all-action anchorman who United desperately needed. For Ten Hag, it wasn't an instant turnaround at United, and nor was it instant success for Christian Eriksen. What was clear, the more he played, was that he was still fit. He could still last games. It felt like his heart issues were behind him. That little worry was going. But Ten Hag also adopted Eriksen into that Pirlo-esque late-era Scholesy role, the deep-lying playmaker. Eriksen wasn't being utilised in an advanced 10 or in the front 3. Heart or not, at 30, he may well have been adapting to a deeper role anyway, but perhaps the issue of stamina conservation and intensity meant that Eriksen was best used in the role Frank had put him into. It wasn't entirely new to Eriksen either, having previously played in a central midfield 3, albeit a little more advanced. United fans were torn at first. When the team wasn't convincing or looked overrun in midfield, Eriksen was potentially a weakness. However, Ten Hag solved the Ronaldo issue by dropping him. He then got Bruno and Rashford playing well again. The team were gelling, and Eriksen's presence became more immediately obvious. Yes, he was making them tick. He and Casemiro were the key orchestrators of quick, transitional turnovers, sending United on the front foot. In Eriksen's first 15 games, he registered a goal and 5 assists, but his incisive play and his vision were benefiting the side enormously. Likewise, he gives United a threat from set pieces too. Truly, for football lovers around the world, the resurrection of Christian Eriksen has been a joy to watch. Just what he can achieve after 30 remains to be seen. Can he help bring trophies back to Manchester United? Tell us what you think in the comments.